Hey, Dena here. Full disclosure, what I'm showing you today is a failed experiment, which I normally wouldn't share, but considering that the goal was to make a cake that looked like a realistic NES controller using no fondant, I think it was a pretty good try and I wanted to show the process. I will share all of the recipes involved, but this is really more about the method. The first thing I did was find some images online of an NES controller. A couple were just to look at for reference, but one was more of a diagram, and that one I took into Photoshop and blew up so I could print it out. Basically, I took the rectangular baking pan I planned to use and figured out the best way to trim the cake to be the dimensions of the controller. But obviously I had to make the cake first. We were low on money at the time, and I had a box of cake mix on hand. But I still wanted the cake to be as good as it could be, so I borrowed a book from my mom called The Cake Mix Doctor, which is a collection of recipes that use cake mix as a base. I went with old-fashioned devil's food cake. So I was able to find this recipe online, so I'll link to it in the description, but you will need 1 package of devil's food cake, mine was just regular chocolate, again I wanted to use what I had, 2 tablespoons of unsweetened cocoa powder, 1 1/3 cups of buttermilk. The reason mine looks so thick is that I used that hack where you take regular milk and add a little acid and then let it sit until it thickens a little. Well, for some reason I started with heavy cream, and then once I added the acid, probably lemon juice, this was a year ago, I proceeded to let it sit for a very long time, so I ended up with what was basically sour cream. The recipe still worked out though. 1/2 cup of vegetable oil, I used olive oil, I don't keep vegetable oil on hand, 3 large eggs, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Combine all of that and then use an electric mixer on low for 1 minute, scrape down the sides, and then mix on medium for 2 more minutes. Then I dumped all that batter into the greased pan, then smoothed it out on the top because it was kind of thick. I also used cake strips for the first time here because I didn't want the cake to rise much, since I wanted it to be as boxy as possible. If you don't know what cake strips are and what they do, I'll link to a video about that in the description. I used the disposable kind. So I put the cake in the oven, which had been preheating at 350 degrees, and I set the timer for 35 minutes. And here's the finished product as far as the cake itself is concerned, and you can see that it's nice and flat on top, just like I wanted. I think the cake itself is the only aspect of this project that turned out perfect. Step 2. I didn't show myself trimming and reshaping the cake to be the dimensions of the controller, but you can see that I did that. I took the pieces from the long sides and glued them to the short sides using ganache. If you don't know, ganache is literally just equal parts chocolate and cream. Feel free to look up a recipe if you need one, since I didn't show myself making it. So here's the first mistake I made. Since the icing wasn't going to be chocolate, since it had to be gray, I wanted to add a little more chocolate to this cake, so I frosted it with ganache first. What I probably should have done was cut the cake into 2 layers and then put the ganache between the layers, but I think I was afraid of messing something up. I could have also used chocolate frosting as a crumb coat, which would have had a similar effect flavor-wise. But yeah, I do think I did a good job of smoothing out the ganache, but it ended up still being a little bumpy, and spreading icing over it was a pain. Speaking of which, again, I didn't show myself making it because this is more about the technique. I used Swiss buttercream, specifically the recipe from Gretchen's bakery, which I'm gonna have to type into the description because it doesn't exist anymore since she switched to Gretchen's vegan bakery and now the non-vegan recipes aren't there anymore. By the way, I forgot to mention that the cake went into the freezer after every single step. Once I made the cake, it went into the freezer, and then I put ganache on it, and then it went into the freezer again before frosting it. But yeah, I tried to make the icing as smooth as possible. Not such a big deal if you're using fondant, but if you're not using fondant, it's gotta be perfectly smooth. Because what you see is what you get. There is no margin for error. So, the method I used for putting all the details on the controller is called the Frozen Buttercream method. Like I said earlier, I printed out a diagram of the controller and the size I wanted the cake, taped it to a board, and then taped wax paper on top of it. I used that as a guide for all the different blocks of color and details. I didn't film myself doing the light gray, probably because I had never done this before and wanted to focus on getting it right rather than worrying about whether or not I was filming correctly or whatever. So this part starts after I took it out of the freezer. For the red text, there was so little of it that I didn't want to use buttercream, and I already had some red candy melts for the buttons, so I went ahead and did that in red candy melt. It ended up looking a little off up close, but it looked good from a distance. I basically melted them in a Ziploc bag and then cut a tiny hole in the corner and used it as a piping bag. Then back in the freezer. Then I did the dark gray areas in the same way, though I used a big Ziploc bag with a piping tip so I wouldn't have a piping bag to wash later. Then back into the freezer again. Finally, there was that black background, though the icing looks more charcoal. It does get darker over time. Here's another mistake I made. Unless you're starting with dark chocolate icing, never use liquid food coloring to try to get black icing. I ended up using a ridiculous amount to even get the icing this dark, and who knows how many chemicals we all ingested because of that. And back in the freezer. So here's where I made that major fuck up that I know everyone noticed on the title card. I didn't film myself doing this part, but I put some more gray icing over that entire part that I'd been working on, thinking I could get the frozen buttercream to stick to the cake better that way. I don't know why it didn't occur to me that it would become soft after that, but, well, here, I'll turn the sound back on for this part. Sorry for the background noise, I didn't intend to use any of the audio from this footage. No, oh my god, no.
What happened?
Oh my god, it broke.
What broke?
It's over a year later and that still hurts to watch. Yeah, it broke in the middle when I picked it up. I pieced it back together as best I could and put it back in the freezer, but that visible crack wasn't going anywhere. Okay, so, take 2 for putting the transfer on the cake. Straight from the freezer like I should have done in the first place. And that's how the frozen buttercream transfer method works. In my case, the transfer somehow ended up being a tiny bit big for the cake, so I added more frosting to the sides to make up for it. Again, making it as smooth as possible. Here's something I shouldn't have bothered with. I tried to do that slightly raised frame effect, if you know what I mean. There was no way that was going to be neat enough to look good. Honestly, from a distance like that, it doesn't look that bad, right? So here's where I make the buttons. I ended up just using candy melts, but that was not my first choice. I wanted them to be stiff enough to hold up, but soft enough that I could cut through them. And my first thought was that I could mix candy melts with cream and probably some food coloring and make a kind of ganache. But I could not get it to solidify even in the freezer. No matter how much candy melt to cream ratio I had, it stayed the consistency of thick syrup. So I ended up using just candy melts, which I would just have to pop off when it was time to cut the cake. Come to think of it though, people make roses out of buttercream and they hold up just fine on a cake, so maybe I could have just used more buttercream for the buttons as long as I froze it first. In any case, here I am putting the buttons on the cake as the finishing touch, and finally that stupid thing was done. This thing took like a week of planning and at least 2 days to make. And here's some footage Lee took of the finished product. It was actually his birthday cake last year, and here I am cutting it. Don't worry, the buttons did get eaten, they didn't go to waste. I just couldn't cut through them. And here's a picture of a piece I had at some point. It may not look perfect, but it was delicious. That box cake recipe turned out really good. You'd never guess it was made with cake mix. And Gretchen's old buttercream recipe is probably the best cake frosting I've ever had in my life. They went amazing together, along with the hidden layer of ganache. So how should I end this video? I guess I'm wondering what you all think of how it turned out, all things considered, and how you think I could have done it better. I still feel like this might be a good method to use for making a cake that looks like an NES controller without fondant, but it'd probably take some practice to get it just right. Oh, and for the record, I'm not someone who dislikes fondant. I just figured it'd be very easy to do it that way and I wanted to challenge myself. Other than that, let me know if you're as crazy as me and decide to try making this or something similar. I'd love to know how it turns out. That's it for now. See you next time.